What would you do if your own sister tried to steal your share of the family inheritance, all while pretending it was for your own good? It's a chilling thought, yet that's exactly what happened in our family, and the worst part? She didn't even think she was doing anything wrong. My Aunt Karen, the youngest of 3 sisters, was the kind of person who always got what she wanted. Charming, manipulative, and always with a plan, Karen had a way of making everyone around her believe she was acting out of kindness, when in reality, she was more interested in power. The cabin was the crown jewel of our family's small legacy, and Karen had wanted it for years. But what she didn't count on was my dad, Jack, being unwilling to let her take what wasn't hers. The story starts with a cabin, tucked away in the woods, owned by 3 sisters, Eleanor, my grandmother, Karen, her younger sister, and the eldest sister, who had passed away years before. By 2006, the cabin was split between Eleanor and Karen, with my cousins, the children of the deceased sister, owning the other share. It was a simple enough arrangement, but one that Karen wanted to change. She spent most weekends at the cabin, relishing in the quiet and seclusion, while Eleanor and my dad, who was now handling all of the financial responsibilities after my grandpa's death, rarely visited. Despite the lack of use, my grandmother always paid her share for maintenance. That's when Karen began planting the seeds. For years, she'd been talking about buying out my grandmother's share. She'd drop hints, making it clear that she was the one who truly cared about the place. But what no one knew was that Karen had already begun to lay the groundwork for something much more sinister, something that would ultimately break the family apart. A few months later, in the winter of 2006, Karen made a visit to Eleanor that would change everything. It wasn't a regular visit, one of those casual drop-ins that Karen had done in the past, but a deliberate, planned stay. She stayed overnight, something that had never happened before, and Eleanor, perhaps out of a sense of duty or the comfort of her sister's company, agreed. Looking back, I can see it clearly now, it wasn't just a family visit. It was Karen's opportunity to finalize a plan that she had been working on in secret for far too long. The morning after her overnight stay, Jack received a call from Eleanor. They chatted, as they always did, about the usual family matters, but then Eleanor casually mentioned that Karen had brought some papers with her for her to sign. This was the moment everything started to unravel. Eleanor had signed papers, yes, but they were no ordinary papers. They were the deed to the cabin, with a lowball price of $3,000 listed for the transfer of her share. It sounded like a small, almost laughable figure in the context of the cabin's true market value. Jack's heart sank as he listened to his mother explain the details. Karen had come over, acting like it was just a normal thing, bringing with her a pre-prepared deed for Eleanor's signature. There was no real discussion. No proper consultation. Just Karen pushing forward with the deal, making sure Eleanor was too overwhelmed to even think about it. Eleanor, who had never understood the complexities of money or property values, agreed to the price without question. After all, she trusted her younger sister, and Karen had made it sound like this was a simple favor, something Eleanor had to do to help the family. But there was no helping the family here. There was only Karen looking to snatch up the property for pennies on the dollar. When Jack heard the price, he immediately felt the heat rise in his chest. $3,000? The cabin was worth much more than that, a far cry from what Karen had suggested. But it wasn't just the price, it was the way Karen had done it. She'd caught Eleanor in a vulnerable moment, isolated her, and used her trust to take advantage of her lack of financial savvy. She had stayed overnight to ensure that Eleanor wouldn't have the opportunity to call Jack, to discuss it, or to think it over. It was a perfect trap, and Karen had set it in motion like an expert manipulator. Jack wasn't one to back down, though. His blood boiled as he processed the betrayal. This wasn't just about money, this was about the inheritance of his family, a legacy that Karen had no right to steal. He couldn't let it happen, not on his watch. He immediately called Karen, demanding an explanation, but she simply shrugged off his concerns. She insisted that Eleanor had set the price herself, that it was her decision, and that Jack was just being unreasonable. She was infuriatingly calm, as if everything was perfectly fine. The more Jack pushed, the more Karen defended her actions, as if the whole thing were a simple misunderstanding, something that could be easily swept under the rug. But Jack wasn't buying it. He couldn't let Karen manipulate the situation any longer. He knew something had to be done. And so, without hesitation, he reached out to a lawyer, determined to stop Karen's plan in its tracks. The legal battle that followed was as inevitable as it was intense. But Karen wasn't the only one who would fight. She may have thought that Eleanor's lack of financial knowledge would be her advantage, but Jack wasn't going to let that stand. The gloves were off now. And soon, Karen would find herself facing a reality she hadn't expected. As the months dragged on and the legal battle over the cabin escalated, Jack began to dig deeper into Karen's actions, determined to find any evidence that could disprove her claims and expose her manipulations. His suspicions grew stronger with each passing day, and it wasn't long before he stumbled upon something that would blow the case wide open: a forged will. It was Jack's lawyer who uncovered the first piece of the puzzle. During the discovery process, a version of the will belonging to the deceased eldest sister was brought to light. The will had been altered in a way that seemed too convenient for Karen's desires. The original document, which had clearly outlined that the eldest sister's share of the cabin would go to her children, had been modified to make Karen the sole beneficiary of the entire property. The changes weren't just small adjustments either. The language had been reworded, signatures had been tampered with, and the entire document seemed strangely new, too new, in fact, considering its age. When Jack first saw the altered will, his blood ran cold. He couldn't believe it. It was one thing for Karen to manipulate Eleanor, but this? This was a blatant attempt to steal everything by falsifying the legal documents. It was as if she had tried to rewrite history itself, erasing the rightful heirs to the property just to satisfy her own greed. Karen wasn't just trying to buy the cabin, she was trying to erase the entire legacy of the family, replacing it with her own desires. The discovery sent shockwaves through Jack and his family. The forged will was an explosive revelation, one that confirmed everything Jack had feared about Karen's character. He wasn't dealing with a simple case of manipulation anymore. He was up against someone who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, even if it meant destroying her own family in the process. Karen had calculated every move, knowing that if she could secure the entire cabin, she could solidify her place as the undisputed matriarch of the family. The truth, however, was much darker than she had anticipated. Armed with this new evidence, Jack immediately brought it to his lawyer, who quickly added it to the growing case against Karen. The forged will was clear proof of Karen's intent to deceive, and it only strengthened Jack's position in the fight. But Karen, never one to back down, had already begun to fight back in her own way. She wasn't just sitting idly by while the evidence mounted against her, she was taking drastic actions to ensure that her plan wouldn't fall apart so easily. Karen had already begun inviting wealthy friends to the cabin, acting as though the property was hers to do with as she pleased. She turned the place into a pseudo-vacation spot, hosting parties and charging her guests for stays. Even though she didn't legally own the cabin, she treated it as if she did, flaunting the property for personal gain. She knew the legal battle was ongoing, but that didn't stop her from enjoying the benefits of the cabin in the meantime. It was almost as though she was trying to stake her claim to the place, convincing herself, and everyone around her, that the cabin was her birthright. This brazen move only further proved Karen's utter disregard for the family and the legal process. It wasn't enough for her to manipulate Eleanor or forge a will, she was now using the property for her own selfish purposes, all while Jack and the cousins were left in the dark. She had no shame. And what's worse, she had no plans of stopping until she got what she wanted. But Jack wasn't going to let her have it. As Karen continued to flaunt her temporary control over the cabin, Jack was tightening the noose around her actions. The forgery and the illegal use of the property would only make the coming legal showdown that much more intense. Karen had underestimated the family she thought she could manipulate. Her actions, once hidden behind a mask of charm and grace, were now fully exposed, and the consequences would be far more severe than she could have ever anticipated. The day of the trial arrived, and it was clear that Karen had no idea how much trouble she was really in. Her usual air of confidence, the same self-assurance that had gotten her through so many other situations, was still intact when she walked into the courtroom. She smiled at the opposing counsel and nodded politely at the judge, as though this were just another casual matter to be handled over tea. In her mind, she had already won. She had been charming and persuasive, after all. She had manipulated Eleanor into signing the deed, altered the will to her favor, and treated the cabin like her personal property for months. Surely the judge would see that she had the right to claim the cabin. But as soon as the proceedings began, Karen's confidence started to crack. Jack sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, surrounded by his lawyer and a stack of damning evidence. The recordings of Karen's conversations with Eleanor, the forged will, and the proof that she had been using the cabin for her own personal gain all pointed to one conclusion: Karen had crossed every ethical and legal line imaginable. Jack's lawyer opened the case by presenting the recordings, capturing the exact moment Karen manipulated Eleanor into signing the deed at a ridiculously low price. It wasn't just about a financial transaction, it was a clear case of abuse of trust. Karen had used her sister's vulnerability to line her own pockets, and the evidence was irrefutable. Then came the forged will. The judge's eyes narrowed as the altered document was presented. It was clear to everyone in the room that Karen had gone so far as to tamper with legal documents to steal what wasn't hers. The judge didn't need much time to review the evidence, it was damning enough. What Karen had done was not only illegal, it was a deliberate attempt to destroy the rightful heirs to the property and erase the legacy of her late sister. Karen's demeanor began to shift as she realized the weight of what was happening. She started to fidget in her seat, her confident smile fading into something more nervous, more uncertain. She tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks were showing. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she tried to defend her actions, insisting that she was only trying to help Eleanor. She claimed that the low price was what Eleanor had wanted, that she had been acting in the best interest of the family. But the more she spoke, the more her words rang hollow. The judge didn't buy it. Every argument she made was met with a rebuttal, every claim she made was swiftly dismantled by Jack's lawyer. There was no getting around the fact that Karen had attempted to manipulate and deceive everyone involved. Karen's smug confidence turned into frustration. She couldn't control the narrative anymore, couldn't talk her way out of the mess she had created. Every word she spoke only seemed to make things worse, her carefully crafted image of the good, loving sister unraveling with each passing moment. She tried to regain some composure, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, and Karen was beginning to realize that she wasn't going to walk away with the property. The turning point came when the judge directly addressed her, asking pointed questions about the forged will and her use of the cabin for personal gain. Karen's face drained of color as she struggled to explain herself. She stammered, tried to justify her actions, but her words only exposed how desperate she had become. The more she spoke, the more she seemed to crumble under the weight of her own lies. By the end of the trial, Karen was sitting at the defense table with her head hung low, her once pristine image shattered. She had walked into the courtroom thinking she could charm her way into victory, but instead, she found herself defeated by the truth. The judge ruled in favor of Jack, declaring the sale of the cabin to Karen null and void. It was a swift and decisive blow to her plans, one that left Karen reeling. The cabin would be returned to Eleanor's family, and Karen's manipulative actions would not go unpunished. Walking out of the courtroom, Karen's shoulders were slumped, her eyes downcast. The woman who had once been so sure of herself now looked like a shell of the confident figure who had tried to control everything. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication, knowing that the justice system had seen through Karen's charade. But for Karen, the battle wasn't over. She was a woman who had spent her life believing she could do whatever she wanted and still win. Now, for the first time in a long while, she was faced with the reality that actions have consequences, and those consequences would be far more than she had bargained for. A week after the trial, Eleanor passed away. It was a somber moment for the family, but what stood out most was Karen's absence from the funeral. The woman who had once been a central figure in the family, always charming, always expecting to get her way, couldn't even be bothered to attend her own sister's funeral. It wasn't just a minor slight, it was a final act of betrayal. Karen had fought for the cabin, manipulated the family, and even forged documents, all for one thing: control. Now, with everything lost, she couldn't even muster the decency to mourn the sister she had deceived. Jack, on the other hand, had already made his decision about what to do with the cabin. Despite the bitter legal battle and the fractured family relationships, he wasn't about to let Karen get her way in the end. He'd won the fight, but he wasn't interested in keeping his share of the cabin, not if it meant ever giving Karen an opportunity to get her hands on it. Instead, Jack went to his cousins, the children of the deceased sister, and explained everything that had happened. He told them about the manipulations, the forged will, and the lowball deal that Karen had tried to pull off. He was transparent about the ugly truth, and thankfully, they were receptive. Jack sold his share of the cabin to his cousins at a fair price, walking away from the property for good. But for Karen, the consequences of her actions weren't over. She rarely visited the cabin after the trial, and when she did, it was with a sense of bitterness that seemed to consume her. She had lost everything she had fought for, and more importantly, she had lost her place in the family. Her desire to control, to dominate, had driven away the people who might have once been her allies. The woman who had always managed to get what she wanted had finally been told no. That simple word, the one she had never heard before, was too much for Karen to bear. She never returned to the cabin with the same enthusiasm, and the resentment she carried was palpable. In the end, there was no redemption for Karen. The cabin, which had once been a symbol of her power, was no longer hers. The family, once united by memories and shared history, had been torn apart by greed, manipulation, and entitlement. Jack moved on, but Karen was left to stew in her bitterness, forever haunted by the choices she had made. Greed and entitlement can destroy more than just opportunities, they can shatter family bonds and leave scars that may never heal. It's a hard truth, but one that can't be ignored. As the story of the cabin came to an end, one thing became clear: sometimes, the cost of getting everything you want is much higher than you ever imagined. Have you ever experienced a betrayal like this within your own family? How did it affect your relationships? Share your thoughts below. Let's talk about the cost of entitlement and the price of family loyalty.